I'd like to introduce our presenters over here. Our second presenter, I'm going to jump ahead there, is Mr. Emiliano Bosio. And he'll be giving a talk on global citizenship education. And Dr. Alan Render, the dean of this college, will be winding up with his speech on becoming transnational for the university and institution. But first we're going to have a presentation by Chris Haswell and Aaron Hahn. They come from Kyushu, University and Fukuoka University. And they're going to be talking about various activities which will help bridge the gap between student desires and the relevant language skills. So everybody please, before we begin, I'm sorry, a little bit messy there, but I wanted to mention that we will be having the 3 presentations back to back. They will be 20 minutes at a time, and we're going to have a joint 15-minute Q&A at the end of the session. So everybody please give a big welcome to Dr. Haswell and Mr. Hahn. Thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you very much indeed for choosing to come to this presentation session today. My name is Chris Haswell, and this is Mr. Aaron Hahn. And what we're going to talk about is basically the disconnect between the way that sociolinguistics professionals and researchers think and talk about the English language as an international language, and how the mainstream tends to think about the language itself. If you've had a chance to read what we've got on the screen, this is not the beginning of a hilarious yet inappropriate joke. It's basically the statement by Master and Friedrich at World English's proponents, setting up the way that World English's sociolinguistics researchers think about the language, which is the fact that if 3 people come together for a common purpose, using a common language, why would one of them be privileged simply because they've been using the language for longer? I.e., if English is used as an international lingua franca, why would the person who is perceived to be the native speaker be given any privilege in the communicative situation? So this was their statement in a document that they put together, trying to create a blueprint for world Englishes. But the disconnect between this thinking and how English is viewed in the mainstream is perhaps best demonstrated by recent commercials and other advertising campaigns for Eikaiwa in Japan, where English is often presented as being an artifact that's controlled by Western users of the language, even in the verbiage that's used, requiring that a foreign teacher be the person to teach the living language. And so English tends to be seen in mainstream language education, especially the ones that are paid for, as being controlled by a gatekeeper of users who are considered to be native speakers. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is in any way nefarious, but it's certainly not by accident. When you go back to take a look at how the language was modeled, about 40 years ago, this is Peter Struven's 1980s map and branch model, where English is seen as a single item which has 2 families from which all other varieties are then subsequently diffused throughout the world. Even when you look at the most popular, most famous sociolinguistic model, that of Raj Kachra in 1985, we still have the idea that it's implicitly controlled by this group of 5 countries down here, even though 30 years ago it was clear that the users and potential users of the language, the larger majority was outside of these 5 countries. Now, as modeling moved on into the late 80s, this is the real model of Tom MacArthur in 1987. We start to move away from just geography, which were countries in this sense here, and also we move on to varieties. And in this model, all the varieties are arrayed equidistant from the as yet undefined world standard English in the middle. So we've added another dimension to the modeling. However, if you go forward 20 years to the cone of comprehensibility model borrowed from Daniel Jones's work in the 1930s. In 2007, Pang is still grouping a small group of countries towards the center, suggesting that they are somehow automatically more mutually comprehensible among the varieties of the language. Now when we get to 2000, we get a new element added to the modeling. We get that of the user. So the user within the cylinder model here is able to move and to modulate their performance depending on their context. The deeper the cylinder, the longer the language has been used, it's become more contextualized. And down here we have impermeable barriers between varieties, but if the user is able to modulate their performance, they're able to rise up and become more mutually comprehensible to the world users of the language. And this idea of user movement within the model is also continued with the contemporary model, Marco Modiano's centripetal model, where the more proficient the user becomes, the closer they become to the center of the model, proficient in international English. But we still find that in the center, the native speaker seems to be already present at this center, suggesting that they have less distance to move in order to make themselves universally mutually intelligent. And bring us right up to date with the three circles redux, the market theoretic model by Park and Wee, where the individual user will select the variety in the performance of the language based on their context, and in that sense, varieties of the language, their utility value will rise and fall depending on what access that variety gives the user to international English. So we can see that by the time we get to 2011, that how sociolinguists look at the language and how users of the language internationally interact has become incredibly sophisticated. However, in terms of how the language is viewed in mainstream, not a lot has moved from the 1980s models of the language. So what I wanted to do was to try and create a model that had these elements within it, the ideas of vocation and variety and user performance, that would actually demonstrate that the more proficient user of the language would be the person who should be more highly valued in this circumstance. So I came up with what I termed the global model in 2013, where you would still have the world Englishes in their contexts arrayed throughout the world in their geographical location. But as you moved through the outer core, the global Englishes, English being used as an international language, you get the transnational blends, you get the international use community Englishes, and once you've moved beyond this, you would enter the inner core where English is being used purely as a lingua franca, where the more proficient users, the ones who can modulate their performance, the ones who can negotiate meaning best, depending on their context and their interlocutor, would be drawn towards the center of it. And if the language that's used ever went beyond a function and became a form of world standard or world, a true world English that could be codified, that's where it would exist. Now, if we accept that this is how the language should be viewed and how language teaching should be based, then what we see is there's the idea of taking a user from one location on the globe and moving them to another point on the surface, essentially in the way that in the Eon commercials, Ishihara Satomi is seen going to New York and learning New York English, and Mizuhara Kiko is seen learning Hollywood English in order to further her acting career. This is not the most efficient way of channeling our students' abilities. We should be encouraging them to move towards being more effective negotiators of meaning and being able to modulate their performance based on context, or at the very least join in the English being used as an international language, where they're able to connect with people from other countries using the common language without the native speaker being privileged. But if we're going to base any kind of curriculum on this way of thinking, on the kind of most state-of-the-art sociolinguistic view of the language, we need to think about how practically we can employ this in our classrooms. This has been the problem, this has been the disconnect. The sociolinguistic thinking has become very complex, but the ability to demonstrate it and move it away from the theoretical towards the classroom, towards the practical, has been under-researched. So this is where our research project came in, and this is where I hand on to Mr. Hahn.
So yeah, if it's correct that this is the current model of teaching English, as we believe it is in Japan and many other countries, and we also believe we want to move towards a model that teaches students intercultural linguistic skills, strategic competence like that. The question is, how do we move from from this model to this model? Now, in part, this is a national policy level issue. It's also something at the institutional level. But as teachers, as both of us are teachers, we want to provide teachers the tools that they can use in the classroom. And that actually is effective, can be effective in Japan, because the truth is that most national policy, education policy in Japan, even though the image is that it's top-down driven by the ministry, it's actually almost always amalgamated from successful stories at the ground up. So what can we do in our classrooms? It's been tried before. There's a really famous example at Chikyo University where they said, what we're going to do is we're going to make a whole new faculty, a new department, and we're going to teach the students world English. We're going to talk to them about how great Singaporean English or Japanese English are. And they're going to learn that they're all equal. And what they found is that while they got some initial gains, by the time the program was ending, or they had even left the program, the students had really reverted back to saying things like an interview, one of them says, oh, I know I shouldn't say this, but I want to learn from an American teacher. So if that direct method isn't all that effective, how can we proceed? Well, we thought that maybe what we should do is ask our students. I think that this can be a general thing that teachers can do, is find out how the students, what do they think would be effective. So we did a survey of 2 universities. This is really a pilot program, just an initial study, asking University A is a public university, B is a private university. University A is a very high-level, internationally ranked research university, whereas University B is a private university that's much more average level. Still, it's a competitive entrance university. It's not like an open enrollment one. But a lot more students who want to be, say, local government employees or company employees. We ended up with 129 respondents at A and 153 at B. So enough for us to be able to say things, but not enough, obviously, to make a grand pronouncement. What we told the students, what we asked them was, imagine your professor is going to, imagine a professor is going to create a course called Global English Communication. Well, here's some activities they could use. How helpful and how effective would you find, how helpful and how interesting would you find these activities? And they had each of them rate each of the activities on a 4-point Likert scale. We grouped them into 3 categories. We have video activities over here, where both things in the traditional, like native speaker focus, like watching a US lecture, blended ones where, say, they would watch a US speaker and a Japanese speaker talk together, and then ones that were strictly, say, Asian in context, watching Indian people have a conversation or watching videos of Korean speakers. In the middle, we included vocabulary activities, kind of as a baseline, since that sort of learning is something that is certainly very familiar to students through their 6 years of public education. And then on the right, we included communication activities, cases where the students could actually engage in discussion, either written or spoken, with people in an international context. And so we rated all the activities, and then we just went ahead and ranked them all, and I don't know if you can see all the details. The rating overall, we can't say with precision exactly how it's ranked, because in any given pair of activities, there's not a statistically significant difference between 2 adjacent activities. Usually you had to go, like I can say for certain the students felt that TOEIC was more helpful than learning business English. But I can't say for certain in between these. So any given activity might bubble up or down. But there are some useful things that we can pull out of the data that we can say for sure. First, at the bottom here, we have activities that were expressly rejected. Activities the students said were unhelpful or uninteresting. And what those are watching videos of Indian people have a conversation and watching videos of a Korean speaker give a lecture. The same 2 activities were also rated as uninteresting, along with studying vocabulary from the TOEIC and studying vocabulary from scientific conferences. So those ones the students are saying are not going to be good for them. The great thing, though, is that all of these, the majority of students said they would find either helpful and interesting. That means that as teachers, we can feel like it's safe for us to go into our classrooms and introduce some new international English activity and know that it's not just going to be that the students are just going to say, no, no, that's not for us, give us the American back, or give us the Australian speaker back, or whatever. So it means that we can start the experimentation process to figure out what's going to be most effective. All right, next set of data is then grouping the activities by type. The orange ones are the communication activities, and the blue ones are the video activities. And you can see that overall the communication activities are rated higher than the video activities. Now, that's not troublesome, but of course I'm not going to know if unfortunate is the worst word. I think it's the thing that most of us as teachers would agree with, that it's probably better to have students actually engage in conversation. It's obviously a lot more challenging to set up an international conversation via Skype or what have you than it is to just put a video on a TED Talk. But it means we want to attempt to do that. Now, one thing we're not certain is exactly why the students rated these as a little bit lower. What was it about those activities that they didn't find interesting? And so this is certainly a case where the next step is not just to get more students in our survey, but also to engage them in, say, focus groups and interviews, so we can get an understanding. Like, is it just that they felt the video activities were too passive? Is it that they felt they wouldn't understand them? For example, why is it that they felt that watching videos of if Indians and Koreans speak would not be valuable, but on the other hand, they felt that watching videos of Asian people, which we just generically said people from Asia, would be more valuable? What's the difference there when one of those is actually a subcategory of the other? The thing I've circled here are the examples where the US is mentioned, activities of the US, and as we can see, they're all above in the top half. That just tells us that, completely unsurprisingly, the students still, on average, have a preference for US-focused activities, North American-focused activities. This has been found in every study that whenever anyone's ever asked any Japanese students what they think is best, they find that they value the US speakers or the British speakers. What that means for us as teachers, as we're thinking about introducing these, is we can't just walk into our students and say, no, you don't need the US. I mean, I say that, you don't need the US, it's true, but we don't need US English. We can't just tell them that they have to ignore that preference they have, because it's built into the way the educational system is structured all the way from the elementary school on up. Lastly, the ratings, if we compare the two charts, what we can see is that they're not the same. And the most pronounced example is the difference between TOEIC. TOEIC vocabulary was rated as the most helpful activity they felt they could engage in to get better at English, and it was also rated as actually uninteresting, less interesting than not. That's good, first of all, from a research perspective, that the students are distinguishing between, they weren't just generically rating all of them. And presumably, this again will be something we want to ask in focus groups, but probably, the students at both of our universities had to take competitive entrance exams. This kind of test-focused study is what allowed them to succeed to the point when they get to us as first and second year university students. It's not surprising they would think that that's the most helpful. But one thing we believe as English teachers is that students aren't necessarily the best judge of what's most helpful, because they may not have had the most exposure to all different kinds of activities. We think that if we focus more on the interesting measure, then that's going to, as long as we have a pedagogical reason and a justification for why we believe it will be helpful, then the students won't turn away, because we know that they don't think it's unhelpful. So we can provide them with these activities that we have reason to believe are useful, and perhaps justify why we think that's the case. Actually, I'm out of time left. So, again, the final finding, to summarize all of that, is that we want teachers to feel empowered to be able to go in their classrooms and start introducing activities that approach international English in a variety of ways. Both of us are doing this. We're in different contexts. Mr. Haswell has some classes that are more internationally focused, international communication. I'm teaching more of the standard basic freshman level English conversation classes. But there are ways we can introduce them. And we have to know that we do have to introduce them, because our textbooks don't do it. Even when we buy international textbooks, they tend to be focused A lot of the textbooks still say on them the British English version or the American English version. So it's up to us to find those supplements. But we can do that knowing the students are at least going to give it a shot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. And our next speaker is going to be Emiliano Bocio. He